Hey everybody, so today we are going to talk about block number 10 for our sampler bouquet. So this one's really cute. It looks very paper pieced, like that about it. So let's talk about what we're going to need to have on hand for month 10. Of course, I always recommend having your instructions nearby, whether you have that on digital or printed. These are the file finish sizes for either the 5 or the 8 inch. Of course, you've got the on-point layout option or the 4-patch layout option. If you are doing the one for the 4-patch, this is the amount of yardage you will need. And of course, if you are looking for the 4-patch, just flip it over or quadruple it. So let's just talk about what we're going to need block by block. So of course, I always recommend having tape and scissors on hand. Those are just a handy dandy little tools to always have when you're sewing. I'm only using 2 threads for this project. I'm using ES 165 for my flip and folds and for my quilting, and I'm using ES 956 that is going to go on the applique here on the stem and the leaves. As far as material goes, you are going to need 5 different pieces of fabric. So we're going to have fabric 5. We're going to cut a rather large strip of it. You are going to need either, depending on what size you are doing for the block, either the 8 or the 5, you're going to need a 2.5 by 24 or a 1 3/4 by 16. Then for fabric 4, which is going to go here on the inside, you are going to need another strip. So per block, again, if you're doing the 8 inch, it's 3 by 15. If you were doing the 5 inch, it's 2 by 9.5. For fabric 3, you're just going to need a center square of it. That's going to go right here in the very center of the flower. You're going to need either a 3 1/4 by 4 inch rectangle, or you're going to need a 2 1/4 by 2 3/4 rectangle. For fabric number 2, which is again going to be your leaf and stem area, you are going to need 1 square, either 5 by 5 or 3.5 by 3.5. And then you are going to need an entire width of fabric strip out of your background fabric. You do use the vast majority of it. So you're going to either need a 5 inch strip or a 3.5 inch strip, again, depending on the block size. If you are doing the optional quilted back, you're going to need a 9 by 9 square or a 6 by 6 square. If you are doing the optional wool, or if you're like me and you are using stabilizer instead of battleizer, you're going to need a piece of batting cut roughly 8 by 8. I cut mine a little bit bigger. And if you were doing the battleizer, you're going to need a piece large enough to fill the hoop. Where we are using no-show mesh stabilizer, that's what I would recommend if you're using stabilizer. I'd go ahead and cut a piece of that large enough to fit whatever hoop you were using based off your design size. And again, here is our super duper cute finished block trimmed to a 1/2 inch. So let's go ahead and get started with this. And we're going to move all of our items over to the machine. So here I have the design loaded up onto the machine. I'm doing the 8 inch size today, as always, because that's the quilt I'm making, and we're doing both layouts. So it is a super cute design. I like it quite a bit. There are a grand total of 39 thread changes, just which means how many steps there are. It's going to take about 17 minutes to stitch out, and there are 9,204 stitches in the project. If you are using the optional Vanish Light, you're going to want to go ahead and have it in your needle before you stitch directly onto your stabilizer. No matter which method you are using, you're going to want to have whatever your machine recommendations are for embroidery bobbin in your bobbin area. So I have in a 60-way embroidery bobbin. I have a 9014 embroidery needle in, and I am currently threaded with my flip and fold / quilting color, my exquisite ES 165. So again, the only thing you should have in your needle if you're using the Vanish Light is the Vanish Light or water soluble thread, whatever you prefer. Or if you're like me and you're just using your embroidery thread, you're going to want to have your neutral color in your needle right now. You're going to go ahead and hit start, and you're going to sew machine stitch step 1 directly onto your stabilizer. Don't worry about this stabilizer messing with our picture, so I'm going to trim some of that off while we let it sew. Okay. So once you have the design line outlined, you've got choices to make. So if you were doing the optional wool, or if you're like me and you were using the batting, either a cotton or a cotton poly blend, you're going to make sure that completely encompasses that area. If you are not using the optional wool, go ahead and skip machine stitch step 2. Where we are doing the additional batting, where we're just kind of adding it after we've used the stabilizer, I'm actually going to go back and repeat machine stitch step 1. If you did machine stitch step 2, it's not a problem. It just does a zigzag stitch to hold it down. It just kind of puckers over here in the corner, and I do feel like it is easier to trim it when I am doing the straight stitch as opposed to the zigzag stitch. You may have seen me do the zigzag stitch in a previous video. That's mostly just to show what it looks like. Another thing they recommend, if you were doing the optional wool additional batting, they recommend that you raise your embroidery foot height, and that makes a lot of sense when you're using the battleizer because you're going through quite a bit of thickness, thus you don't want your foot to get caught on the material. So raising that foot height would prevent all of that. So we're going to go ahead, if you did the optional wool, or if you did like me and use stabilizer and batting, you're going to want to trim relatively close. If you did the battleizer and only the battleizer, you don't have to trim anything until the very end when you take it out of the hoop, where you would trim your excess. And if you were using the battleizer, I would recommend that you watch the video either that I posted or by Hoop Sisters about using the Trimmer by George ruler. That is not a notion that we carry, but it can be purchased directly from Hoop Sisters or any vendor that sells Hoop Sisters products. It's a nice little ruler, not hating on it, it's just not one that we carry. But it is great for trimming that excess battleizer away. So I'm going to return the hoop back to the machine, and we're going to go ahead and make sure I'm skipping machine stitch step 2. You'll want to double check that where we skipped back to do machine stitch step 1. Now we're going to go ahead and hit start and sew machine stitch step 3, which is just going to give us a rough outline of where we're going to place our fabric directly onto the batting. So if you are, again, using water-soluble thread, Vanish Light, whatever you want to call it, if you were using that, you can do that through machine stitch step 3. But here in a second, when machine stitch step 3 is done, you're going to want to make sure that in your bobbin, you have regular embroidery bobbin for everybody, no matter what method you're using. And you're going to want to make sure, like me, have on your light colored thread that you're using for your flip and folds. So whatever that thread may be that you've been using through the project, like again I said, I'm using a very light cream. It's again Exquisite Thread Color number ES165. You may have chosen something darker, something lighter, but you're going to want to change that before you do machine stitch step 4. So we're going to start out with fabric number 3, which in my case is this really pretty purple. We're going to lay it over top of this center stitching out area, the very most center place. We're going to make sure it completely covers the stitches, and we're going to sew machine stitch step 4 just to tack that down. And I'm working with batiks, but I think it's always very important to say the first piece is kind of like paper piecing. You put it face side up. Everything else you're going to put down face side down. So like with all the flip and folds that we've been doing, you're going to just trim 1/4 of an inch away relatively towards the outside edges. So give me just a second to trim that down. Okay, so once you've got it trimmed at roughly 1/4 of an inch, we're going to go ahead and grab our next piece of fabric, which is going to be our strip of fabric 4. So we're going to want to go ahead and have that on hand, and we're going to take the short side and we're going to place it to where it is going to flip over on this end. And we're going to align the raw edges with the previous raw edges of our previously sewn down fabric. and we're going to make it sure it's face side down, and we're going to sew down machine stitch step 5 just to tack it down for our flip and fold. Then if you are using a roll and press or a fabric folding pin, go ahead and have it on hand, or just flip it over and give it a good finger press, whatever works for you, whatever method you've been using. Now you're going to go ahead and you're going to sew machine stitch step 5, which is just going to tack this piece down. Great. Okay. So now again, we're going to trim roughly 1/4 inch away. So we're going to trim here, and we're going to trim here at 1/4 inch, relatively. After you return the hoop to the machine, you're then going to take your strip and you're going to place it right here across the top edge on the long side this time, not the short. Got it laid down, go ahead and hit start and sew down machine stitch step 7. Again, always making sure the fabric is face side down when you place it and that the raw edges are even with the previous piece of fabric that's been stitched. Perfect. So we're going to flip this over now and press it down. And once again, we're going to do our tack down stitch. And that is going to be machine stitch step 8, which is just going to hold that down for us. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and trim that away, roughly at 1/4 inch. Okay. Return that back to the machine. And now we're going to take the rest of fabric 4 strip and we're going to come over here to this side and we're going to lay it again with the fabric over top the previous fabrics, raw edges up to one another, face side down, and sew machine stitch step 9, which is just going to hold it down for our flip and fold. Okay, then we're going to flip this back over, smooth it down with a finger press, and go ahead and sew machine stitch step 10. That is going to tack this down. Good deal. Then once again, we're going to go ahead and trim away at 1/4 inch. So let's do that. Perfect. So now we're going to set fabric 4 to the side for just a second. We'll need it here again in a minute, but we're going to grab our fabric number, we set fabric 4 down. We need fabric 5. And we're going to grab our strip of it and we're going to put it face side down against our previous stitch fabrics from here to here, just at the top. And we're going to lay that down where the raw edges are even. And we're going to sew it down with machine stitch step 11. Then we're going to flip it up and we're going to finger press it down. And then we're going to sew machine stitch step 12 to tack it down. Okay. Now I am going to actually wait to trim that. You can do that now if you want. But where we're going to be going back to using fabric 4, I'm going to trim them both at the same time. So you're going to grab your remaining piece of fabric number 4 strip, and then we're going to place it from corner to corner, here to here. Again, face side down over the previous stitch fabrics. And then you're going to sew it down with machine stitch step 13. Okay, and then we're going to flip this down. Give it a finger press just to smooth it out. Go ahead and hit start and sew machine stitch step 14 just to tack that top part down. Okay. Now you can hold on to these little leftover pieces just in case you might be a little shy on the fabric if you're doing multiple blocks of this, because you do need quite a large amount for all these strips. So now again, we're going to trim roughly at 1/4 inch away. And you are completely done with fabric 4. So if you want to hold on to that, just set it to the side. And then trim 1/4 inch away on all of that. So we are going to be working with our fabric 5 strip for a while now, so be sure to keep it on hand. So now we're going to take our fabric 5 strip and we're going to put it on this edge right here. I've got a bit of a big bulky piece right there. I'm going to trim that away real fast. Okay. So now again, we're going to take our strip and we're going to put it again on the previously sewn pieces of fabric, raw edges even with one another, and we're going to stitch it down with machine stitch step 15. Flip it back, smooth it down, hit start, and we're going to sew machine stitch step 16, which is just going to hold it down for you. Okay, so again, trim away at 1/4 inch, just roughly. There we go. Take another section of the strip, come over to this side, put the raw edges even with one another, and make sure that you have your fabric face side down over the previously sewn pieces of fabric. Go ahead and hit start and sew machine stitch step 17. Go ahead and flip it over for your flip and folds. Give it a good smooth with either a roll-in press, a wood iron, or your fingers. And then go ahead and hit start, and that is going to tack it down with machine stitch step 18. We're going to go ahead and trim this down now to roughly 1/4 inch away, just as before. Okay. We got a couple of more sections to go. So now we're going to come up to the top here. So I'm going to grab this little remnant piece that I have, and I'm going to put the raw edges even with one another. And we're going to tack it down with it face side down with machine stitch step 19. Okay, now we're going to flip that up once again. We're going to hit start and we're going to sew machine stitch step 20, which is just going to tack this down. But you saw where I just kind of took like a little section off of the strip that I already used for that. Just be sparing with it because you do use the vast majority of it. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to trim that down to 1/4 inch all the way around. I know you would think that this one would have overhang at the top. I promise it doesn't. The cream is going to come and take care of that, or whatever you're using as your background is going to come and take care of that here in just a minute. So I'm just going to cut a small section of my strip off real quick just to get it even. And we're going to come over here to this little bottom section. It's a very small little section that it does right over here. And we're going to tack it down with machine stitch step 21. We're going to flip it back on over. We're going to hit start, and this is going to tack this down with machine stitch step 22. Ooh, my thread broke. What did we have in here? So let me re-thread my machine real fast. And bear with me for just a second, guys. I'm going to have to make sure I'm starting at the beginning of this step again. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so we're going to, again, trim roughly at 1/4 of an inch away on both sides. Okay, we'll return this back to the machine. And we're going to grab the rest of our strip. And we're going to come over to the bottom here. And we're going to just align that, again, face side down. Raw edges up to one another from the previously sewn fabric, seam your strip. And we're going to tack it down with machine stitch step 23. Okay. Alrighty, let's just let this finish. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and tack this one down with machine stitch step 24. Now, if you want to hold on to the leftover pieces of fabric number 5, go ahead and do that because you are done with it. So just trim 1/4 of an inch away on either side. I'm going to get some of these little bulky spots I've missed. There we go. But I am going to hold on to this for some of the other blocks that I make just because I have to be a little sparing with it. So hold on to your excess because I just don't want you guys to run short. Now we are going to be working with our fabric 1 strip for the rest of our flip and folds. Fabric 2 will be at the very end when we do our applique. All right. Drop my fabric clip. I didn't want to roll it over with my wheels. So we're going to start on this far edge right over here. We're going to take the short side of our strip and we're going to line it up over here on the furthest left-hand side. Raw edges even with one another, of course, face side down. And we're going to stitch down machine stitch step 25 just to tack it down for our flip and fold. This one's a little weird because when we flip it over, it's going to tack it down, but it's going to tack it down just at 2 angles. It wants you to trim next to those angles at just 1/4 of an inch, but then it wants you to leave like at least 1/2 of an inch overhang. I'll show you what I mean as soon as we stitch this down. I'm on machine stitch step 26 now, which is just, again, going to tack this down. Okay, so I'm just going to cut right here because it wants you to leave an overhang of at least 1/2 an inch. So I've just cut it more like 1 inch or so because I want a little excess overhang when I go to trim it down. Now we're going to trim roughly 1/4 of an inch away. Okay, and because I don't want it to get caught on anything, I'm going to take a piece of fabric tape just to kind of hold that down because I don't want it to move on me. All right, now we're going to come to the top side, so we're going to need to use the long edge, and we're going to put it from corner to corner from here to here. You want it to overhang just a little bit because you want to be able to flip it over to where it's going to like supersede just a little bit, because we'll need that overhang here in a while. Again, face side down, raw edges even with one another, and we're going to tack it down with machine stitch step 27. You are going to have a bit of bulk on the back side, so I'm actually going to cut this strip kind of in half when I go and flip it over here in a minute. So I'm going to cut this about here, just kind of on this long side. Let me pull this out of the hoop so you guys can actually see it. Okay, so I have trimmed away, and then I'm going to fold back, and I'm going to smooth it down. And then because there is so much overhang, I'm going to nick a bit of that off at the top. Obviously, I have at least an inch of overhang, so I don't have to worry about it for my trimmings. But it is, to me, very important that you guys tape this down, because there is a lot of overhang on this, because especially if you're doing the 8-inch block like me, you have a 5-inch strip that's 5 inches of overhang. We don't want that. So now we're going to come over and we're going to repeat the same process in the upper corner on the right now. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. We're actually going to take care of it at this little weird spot right here. So I'm going to take my little strip that I just trimmed away. I wonder if that's going to be big enough. No, it's not, so we don't worry about it. But I am going to just cut a small piece of my strip off for this, and you'll see why here in just a second. So I'm going to take a small piece of my strip because it's just for this little bitty section right here. Again, face side down over top of the previous stitch pieces of fabric, raw edges even with one another. We're going to go ahead and stitch machine stitch step 28, but you guys can see why now, because it is just a super duper tiny little section that it's going to do. So I don't see the point in dealing with the whole strip. I just cut off about, I don't know, a 3-inch long section. Okay, and then we're going to flip it over, and it's going to do the same thing it did on this opposite side while we're stitching machine stitch 29 down. It's going to tack it down at 2 angles, and they're going to want you to leave about a 1/2 inch of overhang at the unstitched area for trims. So I'm going to let this stitch down, and then I'm going to trim a bit of that excess away. So again, I'm going to trim about to where it's about 1 inch left over on the sides, and then we're going to trim a 1/4 inch. And let's come over here and trim about a 1/4 inch. Good deal. And then once again, I'm going to take a piece of tape and I'm going to hold that overhang down. All right, so now we're going to go up to the top here, and we're going to make sure it's kind of like encapsulating a little bit of overhang on both sides. Just let it overhang your block by about 1 inch, just so you get it a full coverage space area. And then we're going to go ahead and hit start with it, of course, face side down over top of your previous pieces of fabric, raw edges up to one another, and it's sewing machine stitch step 30 right now. Okay, let's go ahead and flip it over. It does not tack this down. Where did my scissors go? There we are. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of cut my strip off kind of at an angle. I want to have my overhang, but there's quite a bit more overhang than I need. So I'm just going to trim a bit of that off. Of course, you always want to leave at least roughly a 1/2 inch to be able to trim, but I'm leaving at least 1 inch, but some of this overhang is a bit too much. It's going over my hoop, and that's just going to get in the way. But again, I am going to tape it down to hold it down nice and tight for when it does the basting stitch here in just a little bit. But I'm going to tape well all the way around. I need to get that tighter. So just tape as you guys feel like you need to. Okay. We have 2 more pieces of fabric number 1 to tack down. The first one is going to come down here at the bottom. Again, on the long edge, you're going to take and you're going to put it, again, face side down over your previous stitch pieces of fabric. Raw edges even with one another, and sew machine stitch step 31. Okay, so after you've done machine stitch step 31, we're going to, again, like with all the other steps, we're going to flip it over and we are going to give it a good crease. And this time it actually does have a little stitch, but it's only going to be over here on the side. So go ahead and sew machine stitch step 32, and that's going to kind of give you a trim line. Okay, so we're going to trim 1/4 inch away from the just freshly stitched spot. Okay, so we're going to come over here, we're going to do 1/4 inch trim. Okay, we're going to take some tape and we're going to hold that down nice and smooth. Again, I'm paranoid, so I tape everything. All right, so last piece is going to go all the way from corner to corner here on the bottom side. So that's on your bottom left. So we're just going to take our fabric 1 strip. We're going to put it face side down over top our previous stitch pieces of fabric. Again, let it overhang because you want to make sure you encompass the entire area. Raw edges up to one another and stitch machine stitch step 33. Now, if you are using Vanish Light, and only if you are using Vanish Light, I recommend going ahead and changing your thread right now. If you are not using Vanish Light, do not change your thread. But the instructions do recommend for all Vanish Light users or water-soluble thread users to go ahead and change it now because we are about to do a basting stitch. So we're going to go ahead and hit start after we've got that flip down, and it does kind of base the corner down for you. So I don't really trim off my super big excess pieces until after this step. Perfect. Okay, so I'm just going to trim off a whole bunch of this big excess piece. Okay. And I'm not actually going to tape this piece super heavily just because it's already basted as far as it's going to come over. I'm just going to kind of come catch my corners so it doesn't flip anything over here. Alrighty. I'm going to come this way. There we go. So again, if you went ahead and switched to your Vanish Light, they want you to keep it in your needle for the next step. So this one is just going to give you your outline of where you're going to place your applique. And again, they want you to stitch this with water-soluble thread if you are opting to use that. And after this stitches, you guys, of course, are going to want to have your fabric number 2 on hand. Now, no matter what method y'all are using, you're going to change your threads here because we are going to want to switch to a thread color that is going to match or contrast, depending on what you prefer, your applique fabric for your stems and leaves. So I'm going to go ahead and change my thread real quick. I'm using Exquisite thread color number ES951. Now, if you guys remember from block 9, they didn't have you trim the fabric down here on the ends. They're going to have you do the same thing with this block. So take your big piece of green fabric, make sure it covers all of your stitches and that it extends a bit beyond this outside stitch line that it just did. Go ahead and hit start. That's going to sew machine stitch step 36 and that is going to tack it down. So we are only going to be just a few steps from being finished, but these last couple of steps are going to be the longest because those are all of your decorative stitches, your applique stitches, and your quilting is what's happening now. So this is going to take just a little bit of time. That loose piece of thread there is driving me nuts. And it does do a really heavy stitch to tack that down. That's why I suggest you change it there as opposed to like leaving on your lighter background color, because I feel like it might show through. Even though it does do a satin stitch here in a minute, I just worry about that showing through your threads depending on what colors you're using. So now, just as before with fabric when we did block number 9, you're going to want to trim close to the applique stitches. So not a 1/4 of an inch away, close, just to the applique fabrics. We'll talk about the 1/4 of an inch trimming on the bottom here in just a second. So you want to get really close to this one. It doesn't do a super duper wide satin stitch. It does do a satin stitch, but we don't want to worry about it accidentally, not catching. So I'm going to cut that just straight down. And I'm not going to trim at all down here. So you can trim close. You can trim a little closer to it. But I just left all that overhang be. I just trimmed as close as I could straight down the line. And we're going to repeat that same process down this side. Just being careful to not accidentally cut through the fabric on the opposite side. And I've got a pair of duckbill scissors. These are great for like doing the 1/4 inch trims. They are not ideal for fitting in between little bitty spaces. I make it work because I do like these scissors quite a bit. But if I would have thought about it, I'd have probably got more of a fine tipped pair for this applique. So that's another reason like I like to have multiple pairs on hand because they're good for different jobs. But you want to get really, really close, guys. Close as humanly possible without accidentally cutting your stitches. Okay, there we go. So just bear with me because I'm just trying to get this as close as I can. So again, no matter what method you're using, you're going to want to have your applique thread in your needle, your regular embroidery thread bobbin in your bobbin area. Okay, so let's go ahead and get this back on the machine and start stitching out machine stitch step 37. This is going to be the longest step of the entire design because it is going to do a heavy satin stitch all the way around it. Around the leaves it does a pretty heavy underlay as well, so this one does take a little bit of time. So we're going to talk a little bit about the design, what's coming up, just so we can kind of cover that. So after it does the satin stitching around this, what we're going to start looking at next is machine stitch step 38. So if you have your instructions handy, it's going to talk about your water soluble thread and your back. So after this step is done, for all of you that are using the optional quilted back, you are going to want to go ahead and take the hoop off the machine. You're going to want to flip it over to the back. You're going to want to have your back to where the pretty side is facing you and the wrong side of the fabric is against the hoop, and you're going to want to tape that down nice and securely. You are also going to want to change your bobbin to whatever color that you want to be shown on your back. So if you're doing it as the same as your top thread for your quilting, you're going to want to go ahead and put that in your bobbin. For machine stitch step 38, those of you that are using water soluble in your needle will want to go ahead and change to a water soluble thread in your needle only. Because after we do machine stitch step 38, which is going to be that stitch that always runs around the block that either A, tacks down your back, or B, for everybody, it tacks the block down and gives you a trim line. So for the water soluble people, you'll want that for step 38, and then you will want to switch to whatever color thread you want to quilt with for the very last step of machine stitch step 39. I hope that makes sense. We'll cover some of that here in a bit. It just, there's quite a bit that goes on when it comes to changing, and I just try to make sure that I don't forget anything to tell y'all as you're stitching along with me. Now guys, I'm going to remain silent for the rest of the stitch out of the applique because it is a long step. So if you want to fast forward here, go ahead and just stop at fast forwarding after the machine cuts the thread for this step. Sorry, I was trying to get my thread ready and knock the camera. Sorry, girls. Okay, so here we go. Let's go ahead and cut our threads and change the thread in our needle. So I am switching back to Exquisite Thread Color number ES165. If you were using Vanish Light, you're going to want to go ahead and switch back to the Vanish Light for a moment. If you are adding the additional optional quilted back, make sure you're taking your hoop off right now, flipping it over, and taping it down securely. So I'm going to go ahead and, might want to thread my needle first. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to stitch. Just make sure you're watching your fabric, making sure that everything is laid nice and secure. and we're going to stitch out machine stitch step 38 together, which again, if you've got the optional back on, is going to tack it down, and it is for everyone going to hold everything down nice and securely. Sorry if my arm's in the way, I'm trying to watch the block. Okay, girls. So now that we have this all down nice and smooth, for anyone that was using the optional Vanish Light, you're going to want to go ahead and switch your thread right now, because we are going to quilt. This is going to be machine stitch step 39. It is the very last step. Also, for those of you that are doing the bobbin I mentioned earlier, I wish if you hadn't already, you need to change your bobbin before you begin this step to be the color that you want to be shown on the quilted back. Also, before you hit start, I also want you guys to bring your needle and pull it into the up, pull your thread up. So just hit your needle down, needle up button twice. That'll put your needle down, then it'll pull it up. If you guys don't have that option on your machine, just do the hand wheel crank on the side of your machine. Bring your bobbin thread to the top. It prevents the thread nesting. That is a recommendation by Hoop Sisters, and I do have to agree with them. It does kind of help prevent thread nesting. So if anything can prevent problems that we could have, I encourage doing it. But again, this is the second longest step of the design. It is the quilting. It goes pretty quickly. It's not bad. I think this one was 4 minutes. The other one was 5 minutes, so nothing crazy. So as you guys can tell, there was a lot of flipping and folding. Like I said, it has kind of like an almost false faux paper piece look to it. But it looks pretty cool. Like, I like this block. It's different than the others we've done. It has the paper piecing, then it has this very traditional applique in the hoop embroidery applique here at the bottom, and they just pair very, very nicely to one another. So once you have finished quilting, you are going to then take the hoop off the machine, and you are going to trim however that you have been doing for your project. So the pattern recommendation recommends 1/4 inch away. I'm doing a 1/2 inch because I am doing the back at the end. I am not adding the additional optional backing. I am going to do it in one full piece. So if you are doing that, I will tell you that from my personal experience, it is easier to get these seams to press open, because that's what I like to do, if you do it at a 1/2 inch. It does not matter. Neither way is wrong. Just keep it consistent, guys. And for those of you that are trimming and you have the optional back, and especially if you're using the Battleizer, make sure that if you're using that Trimmer by George ruler, that you are flipping your back before you trim away. Okay, guys? Just watch that. But like I said, just keep your trimming consistent. And I believe I mentioned it, but I always like to, and I just can't remember. I have, for all of this quilt, used a 9014 embroidery organ needle in my needle the entire time. It's a red tip sharp needle. It's great. It works great for projects like this. But I would just recommend a 9014 embroidery needle as opposed to a traditional 7511, because you are going through batting, especially those of you that are using the optional wool. I would not recommend a 7511. I just do not feel like the needle would be thick enough to do several blocks. But as you guys can tell, it does mix the feathers up. So we had like a really traditional kind of like slightly larger feather in a recent block on the two side pieces, and this one is back to like the more micro-y in the bottom. I think it kind of does it because it doesn't necessarily echo, but it does conform very beautifully, if I might add, to the shapes of the flower outline. So it does a really nice job at that. So you're going to have like these really pretty micro feather quilts seen through the whole thing, but it might just change to conform to the shape of the outline of the block. So that's quite nice. But yeah, girls, we are finishing up step 39. Just like I said, trim it close, and you're all done with block number 10. That's pretty awesome. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something. I hope it kept you from messing up, if nothing else, because that's the goal. I hope to see you at class, and thanks for watching. We'll catch you guys back for block number 11. We just got one more to go, and then we're going to start assembling, so that's exciting. Happy sewing, girls. Enjoy your beautiful block number 10. Until next time, bye-bye.